Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Sifted Talks. I will waffle on for a little while I wait for all of the participants to join. For those of you who haven't been to a million of these Sifted Talks already, I am Amy Lewin. I'm the editor at Sifted, as I oversee our team of journalists. And we have a wonderful panel with us here today to talk all about how startup leaders can prep their international workforces for M&A. So I'll introduce my panel in a second when a few more people joined, just feel right on the hour. And I encourage you all, I'll repeat this, but I encourage everyone to ask questions as we go through the session. I've got the Q&A box open. So if you ask questions as and when is most relevant, I won't ask you for them right at the end. I will do my best to ask our panel about them. Please make sure they're not super specific to your company, but relevant for most of the people who will be listening. Okay, enough waffling. So we're here to talk about M&A. It's something that we've been expecting to see a lot more of in Europe for this whole year. I think we're still expecting it will tick up quite a bit more towards the end of this year and all through next year. But what does that actually mean for you if you're a founder or a C-suite person at a startup who either wants to be buying some other businesses or potentially selling to another business? We'll be talking through all of that today, and especially how it impacts your workforce, and if you have teams in multiple countries or entities in multiple countries, the additional complexities that comes about as a result of that. So that's all on the agenda for the next hour. As I said earlier, please ask questions as and when you have them. And now let me introduce my panel. So I have Hayley Strachan, who's Deloitte's Director for Global Employer Services. I have Michael Jacobs, who's a partner at the law firm Herbert Freehills. I have James Mallett, who's the co-general counsel at Omnipresent, which is an employer of record helping companies expanding internationally and hiring remotely. And I have Björn Maack, who's the VP of Corporate Strategy and Development at the language learning platform Babbel. So let's get cracking. So for founders who haven't been through an M&A process before on either side of the table, what are some of the very kind of key parts of the due diligence process that they should be aware of, and what are the kind of some of the most common stumbling blocks, sticky points that people encounter? Michael, you're already unmuted, so I'm going to go to you first.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question, Amy, and I think I guess the world of DD really is a bit of a big universe because it covers a whole multitude of areas and really depends in terms of what, as a founder, as a company, you're really focused on commercially, particularly at the outset of a process, and especially if the transaction has been run as a sort of staggered process with round one and round two offer letters going in, that kind of thing. So I would say from a diligence perspective, and obviously there's got Hayley's on the line from Deloitte, she'll be able to comment from a financial DD perspective. From a legal DD, particularly in tech M&A, everyone's really focused on the intellectual property. That is one of the core areas where people are focused on. How has that been protected? Has it all been assigned to the right entity? Where is the IP being generated? Are there, employees with IP or consultants with generating IP? So that is often a big area we see a lot of focus, along with, if there's patents in there, kicking the tires on those things. So ownership is a big point. If you're regulated, if the target's regulated, again, that's a big area of focus. People want to make sure that the record with the regulator is a good one, and everything's been done. Often people, particularly in fintech, spend a lot of time vetting the regulatory perimeter to make sure that the activities that are actually being conducted, if they are regulated, are being regulated appropriately, or some people may have taken views that something isn't regulated but actually should be. That often creates some issues. But there's again, just thinking about the cap table, right? We've been involved in situations where, for example, in fact, we were acting on a deal last year where the founder was trying to buy a company in the Nordics, and there was a founder-led business that was the target, and the two founders had given themselves 10 shares each. But then granted about 40,000 worth of options to their employees without doing a shared division. So basically, they ended up inadvertently giving up like 99% of the equity accidentally, and that scuppered the deal. So even something as basic as the corporate governance and the cap table and the shareholder structure, could also reveal sort of bear traps for the unwary. So every company is unique, and I think I guess I just end on, it's different when you're doing an M&A deal. That's a control transaction. It's different to the DD experience you'll get when you've got VC money coming in, because a minority investment, inevitably the level of DD is much lighter. Particularly, it's much more commercial, much more focused. When you're doing a control deal, you're inheriting all of the issues that company has, all the financial liabilities and everything, unless you do an asset deal. But it just means that you have to do a lot more of a deeper dive and be much more thoughtful about how you approach the due diligence process.
Björn, you mentioned when we spoke earlier that you have been involved in some, buying some companies that have gone through and then more that haven't gone through. What were some of the, obviously, I'm sure you won't go into precise details, but what were some of the things that meant Babbel decided not to acquire other companies?
Again, big question. that can be a multitude of things. And we mentioned some DD areas like financial, legal. For us, the commercial part is very important. The tech part is very important. So this can be multiple things. But as we're today talking also a lot about the people part of it, there's one thing that is not covered in the legal side or the compliance side of people, which is super crucial to us. So we're a scale up. So who we look at is startups, somewhere in the range of, let's say, 50 to 200 people. Can be less, can be more. So at this size, people is essentially what we buy, people and tech. So that's why we look into what we call people DD is a super important topic for us. And we had a case where it looked like there was attrition on the level below the exec team in some key roles. And that raised an orange flag to us. And we said, okay, why are these people leaving? This is super important to have them on board. And we raised it with the exec team, and they didn't have an immediate answer. So that made us wonder, okay, why? Okay, so they onboarded the head of HR, and she ultimately gave a really good explanation on why this had happened. So these were unrelated cases. It was not a big underlying issue that we had suspected. So the takeaway from that is these things happen, raise questions, but you can anticipate them. So the takeaway here is, okay, if this happens, then attrition always happens. We're in a competitive marketplace, especially in tech. Be super clear on what could be the questions an acquirer asks on this, and be prepared to have that ready. Then you can fast track and get those questions out of the way. So in that case, very successfully done by the potential seller.
It's a great point. Hayley, you're a people expert here. What else would you add to that?
I'm nodding away, Björn, because I think I really like that people DD element. There is obviously tax DD, legal DD, HR DD. And actually there's elements of all of that obviously touches on people. And, they are obviously a really important asset. And one of the areas, or a couple of the areas I would call out that sometimes get overlooked, and I will take it down to kind of a more detailed, I guess, people level, because that is, what I support with. Immigration is quite often overlooked in some of the DD aspects. I often make the point that some of the people DD they're not necessarily deal-breaking issues, but they can cause operational difficulties or frictions and complexities that need to be dealt with. So they're very infrequently are material or kind of deal breakers, but can just be a bit tricky. So being aware of these things and prepared to address them is really important. And immigration can be one of those. Understanding, who in the organizations involved require different work permissions and where kind of sponsorship for that sits, particularly if you're maybe extracting, a part of a business, maybe acquiring kind of via a carve out or something, then, there might be sponsor licenses attached to the parent maybe in that situation that don't come with with the carve out, right? And then you don't have the ability to operate on day one, because that individual no longer has the permission to work. So, just things that can trip up. Again, it's quite UK centric, this next point, but in terms of what we see coming up on DDs more on a tax side is something like IR35, the rules around contractors. And that's more accepted now, more frequently coming up in DD and identified as a potential risk area. On the people mobility side, though, what we don't see coming up too frequently yet is questions around remote working, questions around how much does your business rely on overseas talent for its, for your pool of talent, questions around use of employers of record, not saying that they're necessarily a risk area, but just it's something that you should know about, right? to understand what the landscape looks like. And I did speak to one individual at a PE house who said that, he was actively looking at that. I'd done some work with him on a remote work issue in his portfolio. And that work had led him to then think about, well, okay, I should be asking these questions and actually potentially applying a price chip where there's perceived risk around some of the remote work issues. So I think those are some of the areas I would call out.
Hey, we've definitely seen some remote working challenges, particularly in the aftermath of Ukraine, which is obviously quite a big tech hub. So, we have seen some issues on that, and also the broader remote working, just concept in terms of permanent establishment issues for companies as they look to, diligence that. So it's definitely a more of a live topic than it was.
James, are you also kind of getting asked more questions about some of these issues, the remote, the ones that Hayley just mentioned?
Well, definitely. We obviously see it on the other end when maybe these things have been identified. There's either maybe some contractor misclassification that may need to be remediated, or if there is a need for remote work, where, as you say, if there's a carve out or a partial acquisition or divestiture, that you're able to keep the talent in the business, maybe where you don't have an entity in the future, or maybe there's a restructuring envisaged as part of the acquisition where you don't maybe need some of these equities and you may need a remote employment solution. And to maybe the DD point there, I mean, you do need to be careful on those providers, because in many jurisdictions, high risk ones, highly regulated ones like Germany or Italy, there's a lot of providers out there who maybe apply kind of template solutions that aren't always in compliance with local law. So you do need to go down those routes as well and DD those providers.
Another question come in from Ed, and a reminder, audience, please ask questions as when you have them. Which touches on something I was going to move on to, which is who do you actually get to do this stuff? Björn, you're obviously involved in some of this internally, but what does the team that, say, a scale up needs to assemble in order to look into potential acquisition opportunities and then figure out if you want to go ahead with them? Who generally, what kind of roles within the company are involved, and which sort of external consultants and advisors is it useful to bring on?
Yeah, I think you can look at it from two sides, on the acquirer side and on the seller side. So if I take our perspective on being a potential acquirer, this is essentially structured along the different due diligence disciplines, if you like. So on the one hand, there's the corp dev team, strategy team, that's us, that kind of coordinates it, orchestrates the process, and then for the different work streams, brings on people from our org. So that's on the commercial side, it's on the product and tech side. So we bring in a director of product, a director of tech on our side, to be really able to go deep into the due diligence, because that's one thing. Ultimately, in our case, we want to integrate the companies. So that's why external advisors can be super helpful, but ultimately it's our team that needs to be familiar on the subject matter itself. And again, building the relationship between the people who will ultimately work together, key point there. And so then if you're more on the financial and legal side, these topics, this is typically covered by external advisors. usual suspects, I would say, in these areas. And that's where we rely a lot on external advice, but the commercial and the tech product part, that's essentially what we do internally. So that's our side. And then working with startups who are trying to sell, or who have been approached by us, I think this is a super sensitive topic. So typically, yes, it's the exec team or it's the founder, not necessarily the entire tech team, exec team. And there's always a question of which role do M&A advisors play, but they can be super helpful intermediary. But I think the point I'm trying to get to is when to involve whom as a seller. I mean, one of the most sensitive things that can happen to you as a company, if you tell the company, or who do you tell, we are in the process of selling our company, and then either that happens, great, then you've informed people early, or it doesn't happen, as in many cases, you've created a lot of uncertainty. You could say unnecessary uncertainty. So I think the trick there is when you go into a process, internally go through what are the crucial, critical questions that a potential acquirer will ask, and prepare your own internal team to be ready to answer. And that either, depending on your experience, do that internally or bring on advisors early, that you get this outside in, not quite DD, but that someone helps you to get prepped on it.
Great. What are some of the other kind of key prep points you can do internally? I mean, that was great advice around thinking through what are the key questions an acquirer is going to ask and who on the team really needs to be involved. What are some of the other things you can do to, you know, anticipate some of the things that will come up in the process and therefore hopefully make it a bit faster or smoother?
Maybe I can add one more thing.
Great.
Yeah? So, and this is really on startups and the founder's role. Founders, as we know, have an outsized impact on the success of any startup. And having said that, they're absolutely key to the potential acquirer. And there, I think it's really important to develop a clear view what a founder wants to get out of a deal. So what I mean by this is, in very broad strokes, so there's a deal, but what happens after the deal? So the point of what happens after, typically the acquirer wants the founders to stay on, make the business successful within the new company. And you could say, okay, that's all I want. I do this for the acquirer, but then I'll walk out and leave because I'm an entrepreneur, don't want to work for a bigger company and so on. That's totally fine. The other way is you become part of that acquirer's organization and you see a real opportunity there, or the potential acquirer convinces you that there's a real role for you where you can fulfill your mission on just a completely different level. So we had a case, for example, where we looked at a company and felt like this is something that can fast track one of our existing business units. They're so great. We combine it with our existing business. We would make the founder the head of that new business unit because we love that entrepreneurial spirit, everything he had done, and we believe that could be great. And then the question is, how do you make that happen? Because it's a complete change in culture, the ways of working and so on. So, and the founder was receptive to it because of lots of discussions we had about the shared vision and so on. And then, as we all know, in M&A, the world can be very rosy and bright and everything's great. But then what happens afterwards? One thing that we really wanted to find out was that we said an important part of the deal consideration would be shares of our company. So to find out how aligned are you with that overall vision, how much do you want to tie yourself to the success of the overall, of the joint, of the combination of us. And in that case, that founder was willing to take a significant part of the consideration shares, which, apart from the fact that we developed a really, really good working relationship, made us confident this could really work out because he had thought it through and was willing to go that way. Of course, lots of things can happen afterwards, but it's a really interesting indicator.
So just to add, I think on the incentive side, it is a sort of complex dance, I think, Björn, as you say, because on the target side, if you're basically triggering your existing option scheme and you're basically, through the change of control, you're basically getting a giant windfall, then you might be completely disincentivized about staying in the target, and basically you might want to leave, and that might apply to a large number of employees if they're all achieving quite a large windfall. So the existing incentive scheme needs to be reset in some way to incentivize them, as it could be through shares or cash. And then, but it's not always easy to plug in the buyer's incentive scheme into particular jurisdictions because of securities laws, tax efficiency of the treatment, all that kind of stuff. This is quite a complex area to try and sort of map people onto the new targets. So the acquirer's incentive scheme, and it can be, you end up having to do phantom schemes or, other forms of incentivization structures to get them to get into the same place. But again, something that needs to be diligent and thought through and quite carefully looked at from both sides, actually. So I completely agree with that.
I'll maybe jump in and take a slightly different stance. Not that I disagree with anything, but more just to kind of take a slightly different perspective, thinking about global workforce really specifically. I think startups have a really good opportunity. Like in my business, in mobility, we talk about the most successful, highly evolved, effective mobility programs or use of a global workforce is when that is plugged in as part of an integrated set of enablers to business strategy overall. And so with startups at that scale, you've got an opportunity to actually see the whole picture and build that from the start. So having a really clear vision over how you will use your global workforce. Where is it important for you to have people? What red lines do you have about certain locations, perhaps? What's your appetite to different types of vendors, different types of like a vendor ecosystem? And it comes back to that question maybe about who you need to have involved. What capabilities do you have in-house? Where do you really need some help? What's going to be most helpful to you? And I appreciate that there's really often time pressure when it comes to obviously deals, and the time to have that clarity of thought isn't there. So actually, if you are thinking about going into that space, having a clear vision about what does it look like, for you, how would you use the different range of engagement models that we're talking about, and that we'll come on to talk about more, I think. That would be my take on that from a global workforce specific point of view.
Great. We've got a question come in from James, which is around employees of record. And this question for you, this is a question from James for James. And it's kind of what are some good things to look at in terms of who is what is a good employer of record or partner to be working with if you're acquiring a company, and where are maybe some countries where there are hidden complexities around if someone has been employed by an employer of record.
Sure. So obviously, if you're looking for or need to continue a use of an employer of record for your global workforce, for many of the reasons we've discussed, including things like if you want to do some early housekeeping to remediate some contractor misclassification, which I would always say is good to do up front because it can take a while. But if you are then looking for an EOR, across the space, depending on the jurisdictions, I'd say high level, you want to definitely check their kind of regulatory status. As I say, some places it's very much an unregulated activity, but others, as we mentioned, in say Italy, Germany, and other places where like labor leasing rules would apply, you want to make sure that your employer of record has the right licenses, etc., that they, despite what they might say about, we indemnify for you these risks, etc., you can't properly indemnify these type of risks. If you end up being sanctioned directly, that's nowhere someone that anyone wants to be. So I would definitely check the status of the EOI in every country which they operate. You probably want to have a few questions around data privacy. Obviously, they're going to be taking a large amount of PII that you want to make sure that they handle properly and have all the right controls. And I would say also you really want to make sure they have the right employment law expertise. Every country is different. You can't really apply a cookie cutter approach, and you can't really amend every employment contract exactly how you like. So sometimes an employer record who says yes to everything should be a bit of a red flag, because there's some things you shouldn't do. And I suppose maybe as a last point, though, I would hope this doesn't exist in many places anymore, but there has been history of employer records suggesting they'll employ your workforce globally and actually onboarding them as contractors, which really is not helping with a large number of risks, especially the misclassification one. So yeah, those are some of the top topics I would look to cover.
I completely agree with you, James, in terms of that. You know, it can't be a one size fits all situation. So I think if you're being forced or, you know, told that kind of on a global basis, then I think that's employer of record exists as a tool in a suite. And it can be the right answer, but there's also other answers that can be considered and should be considered over short, medium, and long term as well. So I think that's absolutely right. It's a diverse landscape, country by country and business by business, unfortunately. So you really do have to consider all the different situations. And I think keeping the position under review as well, because what's right for you in terms of, day one or prep, pre-transaction and kind of day one might not be right for you even a few months down the line. So keeping it under review, I think also.
Great. So let's talk about some of the kind of nitty-gritty bits of the sort of workforce issues that might arise if you acquire a company that means you then have teams in multiple different countries in particular. What are some of the key ones? You've all mentioned contractors, so I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about explaining there, but what are the Summer and Hayley, you've mentioned the kind of mobility of people. Just for people to kind of have their eyes wide open, what are some of the international workforce complexities to be aware of when undergoing M&A? Who wants to go first?
I guess I'll perhaps come in and maybe reinforce, there's a really complex tax, legal, payroll, benefits, regulatory landscape out there. So some real, there's a lot of things that can be resolved after the fact. If things are identified, there are ways of going back and making things right. But some of the things that are critical is particularly around, immigration, because that can kick people out of countries or stop people entering countries, or it can mean that you have to cease activities. That's pretty critical, so I think that's a real big one. From a people point of view as well, quite emotive, you have to make sure people can get paid. So actually mapping out who needs to be paid what, where, when, how are you going to get that delivered? Those are the two kind of hottest topics that I would kind of introduce in response to that question, I think.
And for us, we, as on the legal side, we really care about on the employment terms, who owns the IP that's being generated by consultants and employees, and making sure that's actually sitting in the target and not being stranded or orphaned outside, because that's basically what the buyer's buying is that intellectual property. So making sure it's crystal clear, and if it's not crystal clear, then getting assignments and moving it all into the right entity in the right place in the right country, and that can take a little bit of time to work through.
100%. I would maybe touch on a few of those points as well. I think the IP, very much so, very different country to country. Even with employer of record, each model is different. How you can approach IP, you might need to do some side agreements or assignments depending on your model, and you want to work that through in advance of obviously the deal date. Similar with the kind of misclassification risk as well. That almost could have a valuation impact, I'd imagine. Michael or Hayley would be able to speak to that a lot more than I, but I know there's been some recent cases, some big companies, I won't name names in case there's clients of anyone here, but there's been some really large sanctions and penalties recently for misclassification of workers. So it's always better, I'd say, to do your housekeeping up front. Tax authorities and others will give you lots of leeway, and in some cases even haircuts on what's owed if you come forward with clean hands and like remedy the situation. So that's also very important. We've just been working on a deal as well that was subject to kind of 2P considerations. So whilst that didn't necessarily impact us directly as an employer record, we were very much working with the client to ensure that all the benefits and offerings aligned from all the employee morale perspective, because they were affected by 2P, and even though the EORs weren't, they wanted to make sure that all aligned. So we were working with them in a long period up to the completion date, because as everyone knows, you need to be ready to effectively go on that date. So it's often good to start these conversations with these kind of service providers like employer records in good time. So it means everything's lined up for that completion date.
So we are seeing more asset deals actually. So GP transfer of undertakings, so employees transferring automatically when a business gets acquired through an asset deal, we are seeing that more as people look to sort of cherry pick assets out of a business, say it's not been that financially successful and they just want to sort of grab the assets they want and leave the liabilities behind. That has been quite common in recent years. So all these different structures are, have their different implications on the employee side for sure.
Normally happens, Michael, when an asset gets bought? Is it no people come with it, or how does that those kind of deals normally get done?
If you're buying the business, the people will go with it. If you're actually just buying very specific assets, you might be able to avoid the application of GP, but it is quite hard for good reason, because it's there to protect the employees. So it's just the difference between a share deal where you're buying the shares and all the liabilities and assets, and an asset deal where you have more opportunity to cherry pick. GP kicks, depends on the jurisdiction, obviously not every jurisdiction has GP, but it's a key part of the diligence is working out the perimeter of the assets and the employees who go with it, because it is somewhat of a negotiation, particularly if someone is 50% working for one bit of the business and 50% working for the other, and you can't really cut an employee in half.
Yeah, to your point on an asset deal, that was the last acquisition we actually did last year. Toucan, a browser extension for language learning. And to your point, yes, you buy the IP. Does it still have people topics or not? Yes, it has. In our case, with the founder again. Founder was crucial to build out the tech, and we wanted again to integrate it. And what we agreed with the founder is, while we bought the IP, we entered into a consulting agreement with him to help us continue to build and integrate the IP into our model. So that was something. It doesn't end with an asset deal and giving away the IP for a consideration, but it can still be a longer journey, and we're actually quite happy with the way that Toucan founders stayed with us and helped us make this successful.
When it comes to the people, what is kind of best practice, or maybe what are some examples you've all seen of it done well, in terms of, I imagine when multiple companies end up coming together, you're going to have pay discrepancies. You're going to have pay discrepancies across different geographies. You're going to potentially have to think about, are we benchmarking salaries by London or San Francisco or Poland, and how do we get around that? You're going to have different perks. You're going to have, if you're in different international countries, you're going to have different paternity leave by law, etc., etc., etc. How on earth do you kind of unpick all of that and decide what's kind of fair or affordable across the company, and then communicate that back to employees who might be delighted or might be quite grumpy with what you've come up with, Michael?
I think when you buy a company, you kind of inherit all the employee terms. There's not so much you can do to negotiate them down. You might be able to kind of reset the onward going future incentive scheme in terms of share options and that kind of thing. But you do have to do a much longer term process of recalibrating benefits and perks across the new group as a whole. And that will take some time to feed through, because you've got to consult, you've got to bring people on board. There's a sort of employee engagement side of that is a huge thing. So you can't take stuff away that people have already sort of banked and utilized. So it's a very tricky part of the integration, actually, in terms of getting that right over a 1, 2, 3 year period after the acquisition. But there's no magic bullet. You can't just say, here, all these new terms just apply globally.
Yeah, just to add to this, maybe one crucial topic that we encountered was B2B when it comes to sales commissions for B2B salespeople. So that's just absolutely crucial that you are clear on how you want to handle this before the deal goes through, because the different incentivization and when you think of overlaps and what kind of target segments they cover and so on. So that was just absolutely crucial. It's tedious work, but there it's money in the bank right in the month after or not, or differently. So making sure that the incentivization there is aligned to make sure people stay, because, well, if the sales team leaves in a B2B context, the last thing you want as the first thing to happen after signing the deal. So that's one example where on commissions, I think alignment is super crucial, even before the deal is signed.
I'd probably just
sorry, go ahead, Hayley.
I was just going to say I really agree with what Michael was saying about it being it's a long-term integration piece. Very rarely do policies align and change, from day one. But I think there is something about transparency, communication during that period that tells people what the timelines are for when it will come, and deliver on that. One of the and I appreciate this doesn't always happen, and there are some restrictions on obviously what information can and will be shared in advance of a deal. But one example of where I have seen it happen very successfully and with really quick integration following and alignment following was the amount of communication and transparency between the two businesses in advance of the deal. The more that you can share and align and understand each other and team in advance to the extent that that's possible with what's going on in the background, obviously that is just so helpful, and it made this particular case a much smoother integration where there was quite a different culture and quite a different between the two businesses and quite different approaches to reward. There was a lot of work to do to smooth things out, but that advanced collaboration really helped.
And one of the sort of headwinds you can face on that is, potentially some of the synergies from the acquisition itself. If you are going to be, reducing costs as part of it, and perhaps doing a redundancy program on the back office or something like that, that can have a knock-on effect on, in terms of that employee engagement side about the forward-looking positive stuff. If you're also doing cost savings at the same time, so it's a very difficult balance to get right.
What is your advice around? Inevitably, I'm sure whenever an M&A happens, people are concerned that there will be redundancies. What's the best way to address that?
I think you've just got to be really honest, as to Hayley's point, and just say, this is a great opportunity for everyone. It's going to be win-win for everyone. That's the whole thesis behind the M&A transaction. It's going to take our respective companies to the next level. Say inevitably there will be some rationalization we'll need to think about and address, and we'll be in touch with people and we'll work with everyone to make sure it's as painless as possible. I think that tends to be the strategy that works the best, but focus on the positives, but acknowledge the fact there is going to be some inevitable consequences.
I definitely agree with that. Communication, that transparency piece is so important, but I might add consistency of your communication as well. Just in terms, it comes back to the point I kind of mentioned earlier about having that clarity of vision up front, so that you are communicating a consistent message in terms of what what's it going to look like, how are they going to experience it, because I think if you have to change tack, that changes, that erodes some of the trust that you'll have built up, and can obviously be a negative impact.
And one additional complexity I'd also highlight is because obviously the tech world's getting more regulated. There's a lot more foreign direct investment restrictions, CFIUS, reverse CFIUS, China is a challenging place to do M&A these days. People are looking more and more at joint ventures as the kind of solution, or some form of complex IP licensing models, royalty models. There's a whole spectrum of commercial partnership arrangements. And that often involves employees moving around or being seconded as well. So that kind of third way outside of a share deal or an asset deal is kind of collaborations, joint venture structures are proliferating just because, particularly in sensitive areas, dual use technology, you know, where there's a national security issue, and that is quite broadly defined in many jurisdictions, getting to an M&A end state is difficult. So the alternative is some form of joint venture that kind of works, that fits within the FDI regime. And we're seeing a lot more of those, and that raises a lot more complexity for companies as depending on where you structure them, and also what happens to the in-scope employees and how they operate within that kind of framework.
Interesting. So that kind of brings us on to what kind of changes might people need to anticipate making to the kind of company structure and how the organization fits together, you know, where you have entities, maybe where you don't. James, do you want to take that one to start?
Sure. I suppose in terms of changing the structure, or maybe changes a bit more broadly, maybe from like a tech perspective for a start, there's one thing that inevitably comes up in the integration post is your kind of HRIS systems and where you might kind of continue to use both or try and migrate and integrate, etc. Those can be quite long drawn out processes, but very useful. If you're not operating on the same systems, it can make internal reporting and oversight quite difficult. And then I suppose maybe outside the tech space, after the dust has settled, I'm sure others here will have more examples on this, but there's always a good reason to kind of look back after a certain period to see, you know, where are our assumptions correct? You know, with these teams, these entities, you know, where we operate has the outcomes been as we'd want, or does there need to be further work we want to do from entities through people through operating models? So it doesn't end, you know, after the deal's gone through. It's good to take a really strategic look back and see if all your expectations have been met and if you need to do more.
Hayley?
Yeah, I'll come in and add, again, it is a keep it under review answer, really, because it can really depend on, well, do you have a hot talent market that you want to access? You know, you might start off with a small number, you know, of individuals in a location that then actually that you identify, you know, actually this is a real good place for us in terms of access to talent. It's a real good place for us in terms of access to market, client opportunities, whatever the, you know, the business is. And so it's under review, and you might then move from something that's more agile, fluid, you know, kind of a shorter term solution into, well, actually, yes, we think we need an entity, some more permanence and a structure. And so it changes with your business, right? So it won't be the same solution in each location, and it won't be the same solution over short, medium, long term. And I think it's that point about understanding the business strategy. Where are your growth areas? What were the key value drivers of the transaction in the first place, and where is that going to happen? And that's going to inform what happens with your structure and where your people are.
I think when we help some of our clients just expand organically, you know, we often have this debate, you know, do they have a local entity? What's going to be used for? Where are the employees going to sit? Where's the governance going to sit? And I think there's lots of different permutations of that in terms of where people get to, and on that spectrum of having like a fully fledged local, you know, operation. But when you're buying something, you basically have that already inbuilt in that. So you're kind of inheriting that. And then I think you kind of need to do, as Hayley was saying, kind of retrospective assessment afterwards, where you look at the tax, you know, you tax optimizing in that situation? Do you have too many entities? Because just the compliance cost of these entities alone can be painful. So, you know, the rationalization after the event is often sensible, just to try and, you know, reduce the cost of just running the entities themselves. So, but you know, ultimately, some people then think about, well, do you want to move and have like an IP vehicle where we have all the IP? You know, do we want to have more of a classic corporate group with more holding vehicle? And so, you know, it really does depend on the nature of the company. You know, I've got a client who's, you know, has a UK entity that holds the IP, but has Texas manufacturing operations and a bunch of other countries is operating in, has various different entities around the world, and is looking to do M&A and thinking about how it approaches this very question. So it's very topical, but again, one of those things where there's no one size that fits all.
I've a question from Michael, which is how often do real estate liabilities feature in M&A decisions, or sorry, how high do they feature in sort of deciding or not? You know, what should you? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it really depends on the target, because if you think about your average tech business, it's just a lease. You know, there's obligation. It might be a short lease, might be a long lease. You know, it's that kind of obligation is probably not material in the size of a business. Often, it's often employee costs are the most material source of costs for a tech business. But if you're dealing with a manufacturer, you might have environmental liabilities. So it's a completely different kettle of fish. You know, I think that's very much, you're looking at the environmental liabilities for brownfield sites and that kind of thing. They can be significant. So real estate is, in the tech world, less relevant, but as tech, I guess, expands to like advanced manufacturing, you know, applied materials, that kind of thing, we are seeing more of these kinds of issues pop up, particularly in the energy transition, where you've got, you know, inevitably, to solve the problems of energy transition, a lot more capex being spent, a lot more manufacturing, that kind of thing. So there's a lot more tricky real estate issues coming up as you have fulfillment centers and that kind of thing. So classically, no, but I think it is going to be a trend more in the future, actually.
Great. And then also, again, reminder to audience, please ask any questions you've got. Another question from James, which was, he said he did a quick Google search and found that HR due diligence doesn't show up as frequently in a lot of what you can read about M&A online. You know, do you all think, and I guess we kind of touched on this earlier, but do you think it's not really sort of considered as highly as it should be? And what can you do kind of proactively around that if you're in a C-suite? Björn's nodding.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because I would agree it tends to be an underrated, underappreciated DD area. Like, you look at the numbers, there's the valuation model and all of the hard facts, which look like hard facts. But then again, depending on the size of the company, and particularly with smaller companies, what is it that you buy? I mean, you buy the brains and the relationships plus some tech, and that's why I think it's super important. And I really like also the second part on how do you make it important. I'll share one way on how we do it. That might not be, certainly not the only way, but so it really starts with integrating it into the deal hypothesis. What do I mean with this? So when we want to do a deal, we have some hypothesis why we believe this deal adds value for us. So that starts at the relatively high level. We break it down, and model it. So it becomes drivers for a financial model. So, but this is where it then can come in, even if this sounds counterintuitive. But when you look, for example, I'll give one example. So you want to drive engagement of your product. So what's the team at the acquirer or at the target that's responsible for driving engagement? Who's the head of this team? Who are the critical people in this? And that jives well with that attrition point I had earlier, where we found it absolutely critical to know, are these people on board? Who are they? What are their qualifications? And really making this part from deal hypothesis through model downwards. So what's the critical role that they play? Then you cannot assign a euro, pound, or dollar value to it, but you can assign importance to people for that model and tying it back to how you look at it on the high level.
I would say most deals probably, you know, don't succeed because of, well, if they do mess up. Ultimately down to the people issues and the integration. Right? I think ultimately implementing the business plan, getting a shared culture. I think, you know, that's the biggest actual practical risk of actually executing a transaction. So I do agree with James who asked the question. It should be, you know, really high up the commercial agenda in terms of validating the deal hypothesis.
And I entirely agree. You know, I'm sure we've all worked with, spoken to, or even maybe even said it ourselves that, you know, our people are our biggest asset. But quite often behaviours don't match that statement in terms of the value attributed in a real sense. You know, I spoke at another event a while back where this point came up, and the question was around, you know, what would it look like if CFOs, FDs, whatever, actually had on their balance sheet, you know, an asset, the people, right? And how much attention would HR mobility, I'll crowbar in on a global mobility kind of piece, you know, on that. When we look at mobility, we often, I'm surprised all the time how many businesses don't always actually try to measure in some way the return on investment they get from what can be quite expensive to move people around. So I think there is a piece there about, you know, trying to communicate to the business the value of what you're doing with your people, where they're doing it, who your key talent is, and what they are bringing in terms of that elevation question about how to get it up the agenda. I think if you can turn it into language that C-suite kind of understand, then that maybe helps.
Björn, how do you normally work it in terms of if you identify that, I don't know, the head of product and actually the head of some of the head ofs below that person are really key? How do you make sure, you know, because you obviously can do, and this is very common for the founders to be sort of re-incentivized, how do you build a relationship with those people who are a few levels down but might be super important? Is it just you sort of offer them, you know, a nice share package, or how do you kind of, the people who are a bit further away from the process, how do you make sure they're also kind of bought in?
Yeah, really multiple ways to do this. The share package, I would say that's at the very end. That's important, but there are a few steps before that. And so super important part of it is the due diligence. So let's take the product and tech due diligence. We said earlier, from our side, it's, for example, director product, a director tech engineering who do the DD on our side. And that typically starts with, okay, here's an info request list. We want to know how you do this. And then you get into a conversation where you go through the question and answers. That's a fantastic opportunity to really explain what are the ways of working, what's the strategy, what do we do as a potential acquirer, what do you do? So start to build a relationship and outline what it would be like to work with us. So that's absolutely critical. And then once everything starts up with a relationship, and then you go into the subject matter itself and you understand about the challenges and opportunities and the capabilities they bring to the table. That's just natural part of the DD. And all these pieces, if you put all of this together, in the end, you form a view, how important are they? Would you like to work with them? Would they like to work with us on the culture part? And then understanding this, it may end up with, hey, this is a person who needs to get special care or not, or it becomes part of the then special care, to the point we had earlier. Yes, there are certain procedures, policies on how, for example, EVOP schemes are handled. So it's the leveling of on hierarchical levels, and that this all fits together. But going through that process in depth, really from the start, to what would be the offer, and being transparent on it, what it can be, that's something that we've seen work well.
I've got a question from Mamuksha. And if you're in the audience, this is your last chance to ask a question, so get it in. How, from an investor's point of view, how much would you expect a startup to allocate towards due diligence preparedness, given that startups, especially in this day and age, are very budget conscious? Sorry.
Are we thinking in terms of if you're going to be a target, and actually, you know, I guess a lot of targets don't necessarily know they're going to be a target. unless they're putting in a formal disposal process, which is obviously quite a radical step to do and a big strategic change of direction. And in that case, you probably would want to be thinking about, you know, remediation steps in advance and getting all the skeletons out the cupboard in advance, so you actually know, you know, the things you might have to address in a transaction, just to make the kind of process as smooth as possible. We talked about perhaps some of the few areas earlier on about how that might take place, but I think if you're on the buy side, I mean, I think it would just be putting this into your BAU, you know, discussions about your plans. Because when we speak to some founders, they're saying, well, we're going to be, you know, the IPO is a little far away, so we actually want to grow. We want to demonstrate we've got the operational skills to internationalize, and we want to internationalize our, you know, our products, so we can show that path to, you know, an equity story for an IPO. And actually, if international expansion is a core part of the strategy, then you probably do want to be thinking about that as a kind of actually how to execute it as a new part of your BAU thinking at your C-suite level and the exco level, to actually thinking about how we're actually going to do this. You know, we've mastered the operations in the UK, for example. How are we going to expand into France and Germany and Italy? What does that look like? Do we want to buy someone there and things like that? So I think it would grow, I think, over time if you are serious about internationalizing.
Yeah, maybe a thing to add on preparedness. Obviously, there are different degrees of preparedness, and I think one important aspect is, to what extent do you use external advisors for preparation? So this is on the budget consciousness. If you could do the full-blown way where you've got vendor due diligence reports for different areas, be it the commercial one, be it the financial one, as two classic examples where you see this. I think it really depends, to Michael's point, on what's the process? Is this a structured process that you run or not? Or that's one thing. The other thing is, internally, how well do you feel prepared with the people you have who can answer the questions? Maybe they have been ex-employees of those providers of vendor DD services, then you might be in a better place. So I think that's really an assessment that you need to make. Every case is different now.
Well, we do vendor legal DD. You know,
Right.
it's quite common. I'm saying, but it's quite relatively common-ish, yeah, but not by, you know. Sometimes they're called legal fact books, for example, where rather than anything properly descriptive about an issue, so it's more kind of a lighter version of information memorandum. It really depends on the process you've got as to what you want to do in terms of the M&A. But I mean, it's a big chunk of work, vendor DD generally. So it's not for the faint-hearted, I think, in terms of, you know, it's more appropriate for a properly structured process, I think, which is a competitive one.
Great. I think we are almost out of time. So thank you everyone on the panel for all of the heaps of insights you've shared. I think we're all at least taking away that HR due diligence is underappreciated and very, very important. And we've got lots of reasons why and lots of things to know, to look into. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for all of your questions. If you are interested in more of these kind of operational issues for C-suites, founders, people who work at startups, we have a weekly newsletter. It goes out on Wednesday called Startup Life, where we talk about all of these things: hiring challenges, M&A challenges, co-founder fallouts, you name it, it's all in that. Startup Life, look it up. And we also have a whole stage of this content at our event, the Sifted Summit, which is happening on the 2nd and 3rd of October. If you would like to come along, there'll be lots more discussions like this happening then. Thank you so much to Omnipresent, our partner, for their support to put on this talk. And I'm sorry if I didn't get around to your questions. And now I hope everyone, if you're in the UK at least, enjoy the sun for a little bit. Thank you so much.